one thing that I will consistently hear is that the generational handoff isn't doing very well. And I'll hear this in a million different ways. One way I'll hear it is that older generations will say, the younger generations aren't following our advice and they're having trouble because they aren't listening. The younger generations will say, well, we're not given right advice, that this isn't the advice we need, the world is too different, and you're holding out on us, might be a way that that's put. I think there's an element of truth in both sides of this, and I wanted to explore it in a way that I can get my ideas across and it to be understood. And so to do that, I thought maybe it might be a good idea to share it in Paint. To kick us off, traditionally, this is how generations have worked. Generation A hands off to Generation B, and Generation B hands off to Generation C. And in history, it's been pretty consistent, the level of change in the society, right? It wasn't until recently where technology has exploded. In the past, it was, you had your farm, you handed it off to your kid, and you told them how to run the farm. And maybe there would be some kind of major problem that would come up in someone's life that they weren't exactly prepared for, but there were things in place for it. The current problem that we are seeing in our society is that this happened. This gap is just wild. The separation between generations has never been greater, as far as I can see in my understanding of history. And feel free to correct me in the comments, but this is how I see it, right? You have generations where, my parents learned how to use personal computers during school, maybe. And when they did, it was through command line pretty much exclusively. And when I grew up, I was on the computer when I was extremely young. I was playing video games and I had access to technology from day one, basically, right? This is one major gap, and that's just between myself and my parents. My parents are not that much older than I am, right? Like in the grand scheme of things. But to consider, Generation Alpha, who has iPads now, that they grew up, with touchscreens almost exclusively, depending on the Gen Alpha person, of course. And then you have people who are in the same country who, grew up during the Vietnam War. There's this huge separation between generations that is unheard of, right? The gap between, at first, access to technology, but just the world. The world is changing. The world is shrinking in some ways. I can be in connection with a lot more people, but also society, to a certain extent. The communal structures have been degrading for a while. The inheritance of one generation to the next isn't making as much sense as it used to because there's all these barriers in place. So how do we address this? So you have your older generation here and you have your younger generation here. And the older generation, they have their context that they lived their entire life in and they are living in, right? When they were kids, they, played with their friends in the backyard and they explored the woods. And, newer generations, more recent generations, won't have that same experience. Their experience might be a little bit more centered towards video games or some other form of exploration. When the older generation is giving advice, they look at their childhood and they reflect in their own context and they say, well, I have this advice. My advice to you is to talk to people on your dorm floor and to go to parties and to meet people that way. Generally, that was good advice for them, right? They would have liked to have had that advice when they went to college. And maybe that is exactly what their parents told them. But now there is this gap, this separation that exists between these generations, and this gap is just widening. And so what do we need? Like, how do you communicate this advice down to a new generation? We'll put that in the speech bubble. How do I communicate this? Well, I'd argue that the correct way of understanding this would be through something called wisdom. And wisdom is this kind of communication layer between. It's context independent. So if the context is the particulars, the wisdom is what lies underneath. It is what everything is pointing towards. So when the older person gives the advice to talk to people on their dorm floor and to go to parties, What they're actually saying, what's underneath all of that, is an implicit understanding that community is important, and developing the community in whatever way is the best way of doing that. And maybe there's some ways of developing community that are more healthy than others. Someone has to do this work, right? And this is true of any time, but especially right now where this separation is very clear. We have to take that advice, put it through this filter that says, okay, what is the principle? Now, wisdom is not applicable in the same ways, right? We have these principles. We need a context again. We need to bring it down into something particular, and it needs to be lived out. And so there's another part that needs to be done, which is the application into the new generation. And maybe that looks like something like you're given the advice, talk to people around your dorm. Well, really what that's about is about developing community. And when we look back at the original advice, we might say, that's not very applicable to me in my college experience because people are in their rooms all day just playing video games. And I'm not going to go knocking on people's doors to interrupt them and have them have a horrible time. And so maybe what that looks like in my context is I join a club, because clubs are ways of meeting people who have similar interests to me, developing community, and then I can create friendships out of that situation. So I just took this advice that's totally different than the advice that I generated, but it's because we have this middle ground of wisdom that is the understanding of why we are even talking about this in the first place. Now, this is where we come to the question, well, who's going to do the work, right? There's two big steps here. There's the step of moving the advice into wisdom, and then moving the advice into a new particular. Everybody wants to put it off to everybody else, right? The older generation says, well, I give you the advice. It's your job to bring it into your own situation to a certain extent. It's kind of implicit, but and the younger generation says back to them, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm young. I can't do this. You're the one with more experience. It's easier for you. You should listen to me and do the work, right? And to a certain extent, that's right. The older generation has more experience. They have more wisdom, hopefully, generated over their many years of life, that they can bring their advice to be applicable into a younger generation's life. The younger generation has a responsibility because their life is at stake, right? They're the ones who need it. This group is the part that's asking for something. And so the older generation doesn't feel obligated to necessarily do all this work, because what are they getting out of it, right? Like, what is the older generation getting by giving this advice? Like, they're giving the advice. What are they getting by doing all this work? Nothing, right? It has to be purely an act of love to hand it out. When I hear people saying, the older generation isn't doing enough work in giving us what we need, and I hear it around my YouTube channel, I see it in the comments, I can't help but say, like, grow up. Like, you can't expect somebody to be giving you all this stuff, right? But what you can do is find people around you who are doing a similar job, having to convert this advice into wisdom and wisdom into your particulars. Find your peers who are needing to do the same thing, because you both are looking for this. Work on this together. Like, try applying this to your life. And the reason why I'm kind of going at younger people for this is because, first of all, they're the ones who need it. And second of all, you're the ones watching these videos for the most part. To the older generation, do this. Like, the people who you know around you, young people, do this work. Like, listen to younger people, hear out what their experiences are, and don't give them the same old advice that you had when you were a kid necessarily. Sometimes it's still applicable, but what you need to do is work with them. If they're honestly looking for this, like, you can work on it together. And that's the best situation, right? A mentorship situation where, I don't know, my friend Drake has a godfather, and this is something that they are doing, right? They're actively working on, and they might not know that this is what it looks like, but it's what they're doing. They have this relationship, or, the best relationships I have with older generations looks like something like this. So we're working on taking what their life experience is, we're both listening to each other's contexts. We measure the gap between us, and then we try to meet somewhere in the wisdom, and then we can do the job of applying it to our situations. I tried to make this a lot faster. I've done 3 takes of this, and I think this might be the best one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I hope I didn't come across too sharp, but please leave some comments. I'm really passionate about this, and I think this is something really important that we need to have more application of. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into cultivating wisdom, and I don't have all the answers, but maybe in the future I'll make some videos about that. Maybe it won't be as structured as this, but we'll see. I hope you all have an amazing day, and I'll talk to you all later.